Welcome back to the county seat. We are talking today about the title of welfare counties, whether it's a deserved title or not. In the basics of our show, we kind of covered how these titles came to be and the programs that are associated with them, SRS and PILT. Joining us for a conversation about them as we try to dig a little deeper into the details, we have a county that knows both of those funding systems, SRS and PILT, Darin Bushman from Piute County, and Mark Ward, a public lands attorney who's president of Balance Resources, which is a nonprofit organization that deals in advocacy and policy and education on public land issues. Did I get that right, Mark?
You did. Thank you.
Very good. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
So at the end of the story, we kind of alluded to the fact that all of the problems with these federal programs that East Coast people are calling welfare and subsidies probably wouldn't be an issue if you could levy property tax like everybody else on federal lands. How much of a problem would that solve if you were actually to do that?
Oh, in my county, we've been through this exercise. And so in my county, you know, we bring about $240,000 a year in PILT. I realize that's a small amount compared to some counties. We have a really small budget. But if you were to just take the land in our county, which is federally controlled, which is about 362,000 acres, and you were to value it at the lowest valuation that we could, that would work out to be about $2.9 million in taxes that we would collect. I'm only to assume that if we were to do a true evaluation, it would be much higher than that because there are pristine lands, there are riparian areas and other things. But we just took it and said, look, if we just look at the very lowest common denominator, what's the valuation that we would apply our levy to? We should be getting roughly $2.9 million.
So that, I mean, in simple math, that's about 10 cents on the dollar.
Yep, 10 cents on the dollar.
Does this put other taxpayers at a disadvantage?
Absolutely. When you consider that the value of the services that rural counties provide, law enforcement, education, emergency services, whatnot, you cost that out, and then you look at the funding that's coming in from the Department of Interior and the Forest Service, absolutely, the taxpayers of these counties are left making up the difference. By that I mean those who reside on private lands who are taxed under the state and county tax system. Our state constitution, Utah's constitution, forbids counties from taxing federal lands and state lands like SITLA and sovereign lands. So it just can't happen. And so you got two things going on. You got the feds not paying their freight, getting a really good deal, and you got private citizen taxpayers making up the difference.
Is that I mean, is that hugely significant?
It's hugely significant, especially when you figure a county like ours, it's 74% federally controlled. You know, our county is the Wasatch Front's playground. And so all of that cost that Mark talks about in, you know, law enforcement and all of those things, the bulk of that is borne by the citizens of the county, right? Because the amount of money that the federal government's paying for those lands that they're in control of is, like I said, 10 cents on the dollar.
So SRS, obviously the funding ran out in the 2016, as we found out in the story, 2016 was the last year that they funded it. You've gone back to the old royalty system, which we also explained in the story. What kind of impact when you knew that SRS wasn't coming forward? Paint a real picture for me in your county. What did that do?
Well, you have to understand in my county, we run an extremely tight ship in our road department, $500 and some thousand a year budget in our road department. When we're getting $140,000, $150,000 in SRS that comes into the road department. Commissioners prior to me were smart. We didn't tie wages to that, so that's been operating expenses. But you know, it runs 23, 28% of our budget in our road department, and in 2016 it's 2%. 2% of the revenue coming in is coming in through SRS. So it was a huge impact for us. And 2018 budget is completely stripped out at this point in time. And I think the other thing that people need to understand is the PILT offset, Chad. So, you know, we're losing that $100 and some thousand out of our road department because of SRS. But we're also looking at a 40% reduction in our PILT numbers, because now all of the northeastern states, they don't have that PILT offset. So we're looking at a reduction in PILT. So it's not just SRS that goes away that hits us.
Well, so explain a PILT offset for me. I don't quite understand that.
Under the law that governs the payment in lieu of taxes program, the first thing you do is you apply a per acre assessment,
Right.
and then you look at prior year payments, and those are any kinds of payments that have come to counties under any other types of programs, which include SRS, which include mineral lease money. Mm-hmm. And every dollar that touches a county from these other programs is a dollar for dollar offset to what they would have received under PILT.
Subtracted under PILT.
Right.
So how does a Northwest offset in Oregon and Washington affect Piute County in the offset? I'm
so
not
there's
sure.
there's only what, $460 million in the pool, and so those counties were not
in the PILT pool.
Yeah, in the PILT pool, those counties were not receiving as much PILT as they were potentially eligible for, because they were getting large SRS payments. Now the SRS payment goes away. Those counties now are entitled to the full portion of the PILT. Well, we still have one size pool. So now what we've done is we've divvied up the proceeds in the pool across a much larger spectrum.
So basically, counties receive compensation on a percentage that they qualify for in comparison to other counties of the existing pool, not a guaranteed amount of money.
Right. The pie's only so big. Every year it's only so big.
Right.
Now you got these Northwest counties, Northwest United States, who have far, far less SRS money coming in, so they have far, far greater claim to the pie that is PILT. Well, that means it's all got to be shifted around. And it means that counties in Utah and others who aren't as heavily forested as the Northwest, we get hit. So Darin's right, we get hit, first of all, on the SRS, then we get hit not as drastically, but significantly in less PILT money.
So somebody would raise the question, if they looked at the story, PILT is an offset for federal lands. It applies everywhere, even in states like Virginia and Texas. Why aren't these folks complaining like we are out in the West? I mean, you know, they're losing PILT money as well, aren't they?
Yeah, but the 74% of my county is federally controlled, and you're talking in the east, you know, 2-3% of their counties or less.
67% of all Utah land is federal land. You go back east, you know, you're talking maybe single digits, the percentage of land that is federal land. So the hit to them, just by virtue of the math, is they don't feel the hit like the states do in the West.
So they basically are like losing 20% or 40, as you used, 40% of the money they're receiving, but that's only offsetting like one building or one hospital as compared to most of the agricultural land in a county?
You could look at it that way. What really torques this up in a bad way for counties in Utah is that the counties here already have a relatively low tax base and relatively low amount of population in industry. And they have a huge amount of land to provide services for, roads and search and rescue. And you contrast that to an eastern state, an eastern county, where their road structure, maybe 1 or 2% of it is needed to keep federal lands open. And maybe 2 or 3% of their search and rescue is needed to keep a search and rescue operation going on their tiny little percent of federal lands. That's just exact opposite here. You know, Darin's county, low population, low amount of human resources, low amount of industry, yet surrounded by millions of acres of public land.
And trails and routes and recreation areas.
All that needs servicing, all that need access, all that need search and rescue sometimes, and it's got to come out of somewhere. And so it's I want to say the word scandal, something that's a heavy word, but when you think about what's happening here, the disproportionate scale of the economics here, it's a real crisis. And that's why it's really hard for me, Chad, to hear some critics say that PILT and SRS is a, quote, welfare program for Western counties. Chad, the only welfare going on here is the welfare assistance, you could call it that, to the federal agencies who don't have to pay their way for all the services they're getting. That's where the welfare is.
So I'm going to ask you a question. You know, right now you're going back to the old formula of the 25% royalty, which doesn't account much in Piute County. It probably did at one point. I would imagine at one point you had a little bit more active forestry.
Yeah, there was a little more
industry.
Sure.
If you had your druthers, would you rather go back to a royalty system and have a robust forestry service, or would you rather go to a property tax base and have the federal government pay property tax like everybody else?
I absolutely would like the federal government to carry their fair share and carry it in the form of property tax, just like everybody else.
But we can't do that.
Not with the snap of a finger, no. The ship turns very slowly in two respects. Ramping up logging activities and forest products activities enough that the 25% royalty program would be sufficient. Like when SRS was passed in 1908, there was a sufficient logging going on, and forest products industry was sufficiently strong that at that time the 25% royalty payment, kept counties going. But you can't just expect that to return to that. So Darin, I think, rightly says, I'd rather bank on being able to levy property taxes. But that's not going to happen overnight either.
And I might have answered that different, Chad, if I was Kane County and I had the Kaibab forest sitting there, right, needing to be harvested, because it hasn't been for the last 30 years. But in my county, I don't really have that. I never have had that quality of timber, right, in our county. So
then there would be some who'd say, then what are you getting SRS funds for in the first place?
Well, we certainly had logging. We did have timbering. We just didn't have that scope of it. And I don't think it ever would have made up for the difference in what they're paying in the form of PILT versus what we would pay if we were to actually be able to level up a property, an appropriate amount of property taxes.
But meanwhile, you still have the expenses of the roads, the search and rescue, the education, the other county services. Those are ongoing, and somebody's got to pay for those.
Do you have any idea how counties generate revenue, like say in Wisconsin or Minnesota, where you've got large tracts of privately owned forests? Do they pay royalties in those communities for timber harvested, or do they just pay property tax?
I'm gonna say, first of all, I don't know. I can only surmise. But if it's private property, Chad, it's subject to some kind of state or county taxation. And I dare say those counties back east find a way to levy taxes in some form, whether it's an excise tax or property tax or an income tax or whatever. But activities and industry, I'm sure, are being taxed in some way.
It would seem illogical, I guess, as I sit here and think about it, that you would actually feel that you had a right as a government agency to collect a royalty off of something that came off of private land, particularly if it's not subsurface and it's a renewable product.
Right, and particularly if the revenues are going to underwrite services that counties are providing to the users, to those who benefit from that industry. So, I mean, it's just at the end of the day, it's just fairness economics.
How do we solve the problem, though? I mean, what do you do to solve it?
Well, you probably have some idea. I have one idea just coming out of the chute. I'll just say it real quickly. Congress, for some reason, terminated the SRS program as we've known it since 2000. Just terminated it in 2016. Senator Hatch and Senator Wyden in December, and 32 other senators, bipartisan effort. They signed a letter, sent it to the President of the Senate, Speaker of the House, the White House, urging restoration of the SRS program. So the immediate first aid, to answer your question, what do we do? Let's get that program restored to begin with. And secondly, let's put PILT back on a permanent funding cycle. It used to be a permanent, it wasn't something that had to be debated each Congress. was a permanent, ongoing allocation. And maybe those two things for starters.
I guess you could really get into the end run solution, right? I mean, ultimately it would be that the federal government doesn't retain 67% of the land in the state of Utah. That might be an option. I think the other is, and I think Mike Lee has approached this a couple of times, is that we really need to look at what is the taxation that the federal government is levied on these lands. If they're going to retain them, then they need to carry their fair share of the water. So
if you can't collect property tax because our Constitution prohibits it, should there be a move to fund counties at a more proportionate rate to what other property taxpayers are paying? I mean, if I owned a ranch in Piute County and I knew that the Forest Service was basically not paying anything, what did you say? $12,000 is what is all that came off of
SRS.
Your 25% fees last year or something like that.
Yeah, it was $12,000 last year that we got in SRS.
So I'd be pretty upset. I'd be saying, well, why am I carrying this much burden when those guys are getting...
Well, your question makes me think maybe a conversation is long overdue about changing our Constitution and corresponding bill in Congress to allow taxation, to allow counties to tax federal lands at some reasonable rate to compensate for the services they're getting. That's easier said than done, but maybe we're to the point where that conversation needs to begin.
What do you think the reaction would be? I mean, at a state level, it probably would be a reasonable reaction, would it not?
I think at a state level it would, and I think that all of a sudden it would bring to the forefront the conversation about why are we retaining 67% of the state of Utah? Imagine all of the congressmen from the East who are now having to step up and help fund the taxes, the property taxes on all of this retained land in the West. You have to imagine that that's going to spur a very interesting conversation about why are we doing that? We didn't do it in the East. Why do all of us in the East have to carry the burden for land retained in the West?
If I were having a conversation with an Easterner and I suggested the possibility of property taxation on federal lands, and if that Eastern person couldn't believe what he was hearing, I would say, well, how else do you propose then to pay for all the services that federal agencies are getting from counties? Do you have another idea if it's not taxation? And at least maybe you could start a conversation that way. I mean, at the end of the day, you have to pay the piper. And taxation is not an unreasonable way of looking at it. At least it would spur them to maybe go, hey, maybe we have a more serious obligation under SRS and PILT than more seriously than we've been taking it.
Could that be litigated?
Well, you're asking a real deep question there. There are two hurdles to cross. Changing our Constitution. I think that could be done, but then I think the big hurdle waiting at the end of the road is the Federal Supremacy Clause. I think Congress would have to, give their blessing to that. I don't think that they could be forced to have their lands taxed involuntarily. Maybe a case would test that. I'm not sure, but I think for sure there would be beaucoup lawsuits on that.
Not just from the counties that were filing it.
Right, and so that's why I say the conversation needs to start in the legislative halls of Congress. The lobbyists from Utah need to say, we can't keep going like this. You've got to pay your way. And why isn't taxation a good way of doing that? And put the ball in their lap and let them answer, okay, how are we going to pay for it?
So, on the ground, are there things that the federal agencies could be doing to generate revenue that they're not? I mean, obviously, logging has pretty much come to a standstill across the country on public lands. It's a fraction of what it was even 10 years ago.
Well, certainly, Chad, we've been through an era of basically trying to stop anything at all from happening on public lands. I feel like that tide is changing a little bit, but you know, I think one could easily say for the last 10 years or so, we've been in a scenario where it felt like, whether it was true or not, it sure felt like that the intent was to try to stop any and everything that was happening on public lands, whether it was extraction, whether it was grazing, whether it was recreation. So yeah, certainly there's a lot of things that could be done to allow for an economy to grow and take advantage of these public lands. I think there's no doubt about that.
You know, we haven't even touched in this conversation on the other part of this equation is that, you know, you look at it as a county official from the tax revenue or the royalty revenue that would come from lands being put to productive use. But if they were to start putting those lands to productive use, wouldn't that really have another impact, a secondary impact on your communities as far as their vitality?
Sure, certainly it would create viable economies. It would create places people can live and people can stay, and they don't have to move away when they graduate from high school. And so, yeah.
Absolutely. And, you know, we're almost to the point where the people are dying off who remember all of the sawmills that dotted the landscape in Utah back when, you know, when the industry was taken seriously. But in addition to those economic benefits you mentioned, there's even still another benefit, I think, and that is we may just make the forests more fire resilient. We may just make them more healthy by thinning them through a reasonable logging process. And we might save the Forest Service on the order of $1 to $2 billion annually in fighting the fires. So it doesn't take a lot of imagination to see a lot of win-wins coming out of, you know, returning to a reasonable forest products industry.
I guess that would allow them to generate more revenues to compensate for the taxes they're now going to have to pay to be fair to the counties, but it would also make the communities better. It does seem like a win-win. Any last thoughts, guys?
Well, I think we've got to address it. Bottom line is we have to address it. You know, in my county alone, PILT is, you know, roughly 19–20% of the overall budget, and you know, we're seeing that fall because of the offset. I already talked about the amount that's happening in our road department. You know, it's and my county's in pretty good shape. You go up in the northeast or the northwest and you look at some of those counties, you know, their whole entire law enforcement departments are tied to these programs, right? Mm-hmm. So it has to be addressed, Chad, and it's got to be addressed in one form or another. It's got to be either addressed through taxation, it's got to be addressed through addressing the retention of lands. There has to be a solution. You know, is it an active forest management program and a timbering industry? All of those, I think, are viable options, but doing nothing is not an option. Continuing to kick the can down the road is not an option.
I'll just leave you with two examples. Garfield County, the last year SRS was properly funded, $1.1 million came to them. After that, under the royalty program, $74,000. So from 1.1 million to 74,000, and they still have the same expenses. San Juan County, I'll close with this. Last time it was fully funded, $879,000. Afterwards, $28,000.
And San Juan's one of the poorest counties in the state.
So if there are people in the Wasatch Front, you know, watching this program, wondering how to relate, I don't know, just imagine your income being slashed 85 to 95%, which is what's happening in most of the counties in the state, and still having to maintain the same household budget.
Well, we're going to take a break here on the county seat. When we come back, we're actually going to take a look at the impact that the loss of forestry jobs has had on a community. We'll be back with the county seat in just a minute.